You may recall that President Bush attempted by executive order to authorize military commissions to try these and other terrorists, and the Supreme Court said he could not do so absent congressional authorization. So Congress passed the Military Commissions Act to provide that authorization. Thus, the military commissions are fully authorized by law, and indeed, the trials were to have already begun. You may recall that colleague Sheikh Mohammed and others attempted to plead guilty and to achieve their martyr's reward during one of their appearances before that military tribunal that was supposed to have begun to try them. But now that procedure is to be short-circuited, actually long-circuited would be more accurate, so that they can be brought to this country and tried in a civilian court. We should all be aware that those cases which were scheduled already to have begun will now have to start from scratch with the filing of indictments, the customary motions addressed to them, and the like. Whether Khalid Sheikh Mohammed will duplicate the demand here that he be permitted to plead guilty to what he has already boasted on several occasions that he did, including on Al Jazeera and in a letter to his wife. Of course, I don't know whether he will or not. But if not, of course, he can avail himself of the full array of procedural steps, including discovery and public presentation of evidence that can turn a criminal proceeding into both a cornucopia of information for those still at large and a circus for those in custody. I would remind you that the Mukasey case, in which the defendant, the so-called 20th hijacker, in which the defendant pleaded guilty, took about a year in the trial phase and 4 years from beginning to end, with the defendant acting out and using the courtroom as a forum for his views. And that, again, was a case in which he pleaded guilty. The tribunal and the facility at Guantanamo were put together with the explicit purpose of handling trials involving classified information and the presentation of evidence of that kind in controlled circumstances, along with rules of evidence that have as the touchstone for admissibility whether the evidence is reliable and relevant, not whether it conforms to all of the requirements of the federal rules of evidence. You should recall that unlike the case of a man named Ahmad Galani, who was recently brought here from Guantanamo to stand trial in the embassy bombings case, the cases against these defendants, whose arrival here was announced today, were not investigated, nor was evidence gathered on the assumption that they would be presented in a federal court with evidence and witnesses secured in the manner that they have to be secured in order for presentation in a federal court. That's only a hint of the difficulties presented by this step, without even touching on the security issues that would be raised by trying to confine and try prisoners who present risks of the sort presented by prisoners like this, including security for the courthouses and jails involved, security for the judge and jurors involved, and the like. This step appears to have resulted simply from a commitment to close Guantanamo within a year, because regardless of the reality on the ground, it has a poor image, along with a desire to exceed what the law requires in order to show the world that we can do not only what the law requires, but more. That a military trial at Guantanamo, a facility that I have visited, and that is actually less harsh than most medium security facilities in this country, forget maximum security facilities, that such a trial might actually be seen by the American public and the rest of the world as both fair and successful appears not to have occurred to anyone in authority. In a book that I've recommended in the past and will recommend again, called The Terror Presidency, Jack Goldsmith, who served in the Office of Legal Counsel, describes what he calls cycles of aggression and timidity that have beset the intelligence community, beginning with Watergate, followed by the Church Committee hearings, followed by a pullback and the resulting criticism of excessive timidity during the Cold War, followed by Iran-Contra, followed by another period of pullback and demoralization, followed by criticism after the September 11, 2001 attack of a failure to be sufficiently aggressive, a failure to both collect and connect the proverbial dots. We now appear to be in a cycle where the pendulum appears to have swung yet again in the other direction, and with a willingness to disclose the limits of how we gather intelligence and to risk that defendants will turn legal processes into a source of intelligence for themselves and to a forum for expressing their views. If I thought that I or my family or my fellow citizens had 3 lives to live, I suppose I could be persuaded that we should live one of them as a social experiment to see whether the result here is one that we want to live with. But I don't, and they don't, and you don't. It would take a whole lot more credulousness than I have available to be optimistic about the outcome of this latest experiment. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions. There are 2 microphones, one near the front, one in the back, and I was urged as a due process matter to alternate between the microphones. I don't know that I think that's carrying that concept a little far. Sir.
Thank you, General, and enjoyed your speech very much. This morning, former Mayor Koch of New York, someone you're acquainted with, said that New Yorkers should not worry about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the others being detained because the Manhattan Detention Center is a very secure place and that he trusts the judgment of the Attorney General sending the prisoners there totally. Your reaction to his point about the detention center itself? Is it safe?
Yeah, the MCC is a very secure place. All that shows is that if you ask the wrong question, you're sure to get the wrong answer. Is it secure? Of course it's secure. They're not going to escape. The question, the question is not whether they're going to escape. The question is whether that is going to then not only that particular facility, but the city in the large, will then become the focus for mischief in the form of murder by adherents of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Whether this raises the odds that it will, and I would suggest to you that it raises them very high. It is also whether the proceeding, even assuming that it goes forward within the lifetime of everybody in this room, is one where confidential information is able to be kept confidential and where a trial is able to proceed in an orderly fashion.
Do you have any, and obviously it's impossible to do accurately, but do you have any forecast or thought as to where some of this is likely to lead in the next few years? I'll leave the question there.
Do I have any prediction about where this is likely to lead in the next few years? There was a famous legal philosopher and former New York Yankees catcher named Yogi Berra who said, I never make predictions, especially about the future. All I can tell you is that for the reasons that I've referred to, I can't see anything good coming out of this. I certainly can't see anything good coming out of it very quickly. And I think it would have been far preferable to have tried these cases in the venue that Congress created for trying them and where they were about to be tried. Yes?
What is your view on what is your view on the enemy combatant standard? Do you think that should remain the viable legal standard, or do you think perhaps we need another paradigm, to be created to deal with these type of individuals in the war on terror?
Well, if the enemy combatant standard is applied as it has been applied, or as it was traditionally applied before the modern day, then it should be adequate to the task. I should, just to take a couple of steps back, several steps back in history, some of you may be aware that in, I believe, 1943, a group of German soldiers, well, actually 2 groups of German soldiers, landed off Long Island, one group, and off Florida, another, and landed with the intent of committing sabotage. Interestingly, notwithstanding that the landing is the most vulnerable part of any operation like that, the insertion is the most vulnerable part, they landed in uniform. And they buried their uniforms on the beach.